Yeah. They made a mistake.
All right, Mr. Blocker, good morning. How are you, sir?
I'm well. Good afternoon.
Are you married by chance?
No, not to her or anybody else.
All right, we're going to assume for just a moment that you're married.
Okay, I like that.
And that your wife is sitting at a four-way stop.
Okay.
And she gets rear-ended by a car. And that actually pushes her out into an intersection in which she gets T-boned by a very large SUV. They take her to the emergency room. You get the phone call. You go rushing to the hospital. They have put her on a lot of machines, but they assure you it looks like physically she's going to be okay. They're not sure where she is with the brain yet because she's still unconscious. They want your permission to put in a feeding tube. What do you do?
So they do not know yet about the status of the brain.
They do not know yet the status of the brain. They have already run some initial CAT scans, but they're still going to have to do some more testing.
Okay, what are the results of the initial CAT scans?
Initial CAT scans show some possible damage.
Okay, possible damage, but like what are we talking about?
But she is definitely still living. In fact, they are ready to take her off of some of the machines. She's able to function on her own to some aspect.
Well, is my wife smart enough to have left me a living will?
Your wife was not that smart because she is like 75 to 80% of the rest of the world.
Well, then I wouldn't marry her, but wow.
So basically, you want to divorce her in the ER, is what I'm hearing.
That's right. So
very nice.
Okay. No, I would, I would put the feeding tube in.
Okay. All right. So Chuck, your wife has a feeding tube in, thanks to Chris. It has now been 3 months. No, we just switch. We switch people. So your wife has a feeding tube in, and it's been in for 3 months. She had let you know beforehand that she really did not want to stay alive on tubes. Do you pull it out?
No.
Why not?
Well, because you've already taken the measures to keep her alive, and now this machine is what's doing that. Quick question: she still hasn't written out a will. It's just oral.
Just conversations you guys have had. You know, when you're driving around, you say, you know, man, I'd really never ever want to be hooked up to any of that stuff.
Well, I think once you put it in, you don't have the liberty to take it out because then you're taking life.
Okay, now we got a little problem though, Chuck, because her parents show up and they show you a document that she signed before you guys got married, and they are demanding that it be pulled.
If she signed it, I mean, and she was a legal adult, then her wishes have to be respected.
You're not really sure she signed it. And then to further complicate things, you find out that her parents, they've still got a $500,000 life insurance policy on her.
But she does have.
They're actually going to benefit financially if that tube is removed.
So, in this case, does she have brain activity?
Yes, she does. Absolutely.
Oh, then I don't pull anything.
Good choice. Very good choice. I want us to take a minute and review kind of where we left off last time. because these are going to be some things that you need to be very familiar with for our little learning exercise this week. We're going to start with just some basic terminology. Last week we talked about the concept of coma. And why is the machine not picking up my slide? Let's try again. There we go. We talked about coma defining a state of profound unconsciousness from which one cannot be roused. Following traumatic injury, remember this is a short-term kind of deal, and people will either emerge from this in periods of wakefulness or they will die. So you got basically two ways to come out of a coma. Either you pass or you start to have periods where you wake up and go to sleep. Persistent vegetative state would be then the state that you go into after a coma. And remember we talked about the fact that a lot of folks don't like to use the word persistent because that is potentially misleading. It suggests irreversibility. Since that time, most physicians have opted to use a diagnosis of vegetative state. In order for somebody to be diagnosed, you really need to be in this state for at least 6 to 12 months. We talked a little bit about brain death and the difference between brain death and some of these other things. A little bit later today, we're going to talk about the fact that the very definition of death has changed. And one of the reasons why it changed was for organ donation. Because it used to be that when the heart flatlined, that was considered death. When they began to accept organ donation, when they did the Uniform Donation Act, then basically they said, hey, we need to get a whole nother definition that will allow somebody to be put on a ventilator who has healthy organs. Make sure you understand anybody that has declared brain dead is dead. In other words, the soul has left the body. We talked a little bit about locked-in syndrome, midbrain death, that being a person who shares a lot of similarities to PBS, but they are basically paralyzed. The big major difference is somebody that's locked in knows everything that's going on around them. They have active memories, they can record conversations, but they cannot communicate with the outside world. Terminal sedation, we discussed being basically a system where somebody is given drugs, high dose of sedatives to relieve extreme physical distress, and yet, even though the purpose is to render the patient unconscious, sometimes the patient can die from that. In other words, you sedate somebody so much that it is terminal. Double effect is when they give you a painkiller, a medication, and one of the effects of that medication is it suppresses the respiratory center. So even though the intent was not to hasten death or kill the patient, it still can lead to that. All right, this is about where we left off on Thursday. I want us to kind of pick up here and discuss for just a minute. We're going to get into advanced directives and living wills. In order to do that, let me ask Mr. Coker, are you in favor of or against advanced directives and living wills?
I would be in favor of one.
Okay? And if I told you that when they first came on the scenes that Right to Life people were very nervous, that these were going to be used to basically exterminate people prematurely, would that change your mind?
But just because it could be abused doesn't mean it was necessarily intended to be wrong all the time.
Good answer. So the document itself is not inherently evil. It's the way in which somebody either uses it or abuses it that can be evil.
Yes, sir.
Somebody tell me, what is an advance directive?
It's something to direct your family and while you're in a full mental state, in case like you're going for a surgery of what to do if something happens and you like or have to be life supported or something like that.
All right, there's actually two parts to it. I do expect you to know both parts. First part allows an individual to appoint a healthcare agent or a physician to make medical decisions for them when they become unable to do so. The second part, often called the living will, allows you to state specifically what you do or don't want to receive in regards to your care. So let's go back to the first part for just a minute. Let's say that John Warrens has reached a state where he feels like he is not going to be physically able to make decisions. So he appoints somebody. We'll say in this case, we'll say it's Quentin, to be his agent that he believes will make medical decisions on his best interest. So more than likely, he and Quentin have had a long discussion, and he says, look, here's what I feel comfortable with. Another way of looking at this, many of you guys have heard the phrase power of attorney. It is very similar in that you're basically giving somebody power of attorney to make medical decisions when you are unable to. Give me a couple of for instances of why this would be needed aside from somebody who is unconscious.
Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's is a classic case, guys. And let me just tell you, if you've got family or friends who are starting to go down that pathway, you want to make sure that you get some of this stuff taken care of long before competency is ever questioned. Okay, the second part of this document, and I don't know how many of you guys actually have wills. If you don't, let me encourage you to spend the $20, $30 that it takes to get one done. You can do it online very easily now. The second part of this document basically says what are your preferences on, and usually, you know, these days they're pretty standard. They will ask you what's your preference on feeding tubes, or as they'll say, nutritional supplements. They usually classify that differently from artificial respiration, ventilators, things like that. I'll share with you guys what mine is personally. I don't want any extraordinary means to preserve my life if I'm going to be hooked up to them forever and ever and ever. But I don't view nutrition and water as extraordinary means. To me, that's normal means. I eat it every day, so I don't have a problem with that. Trying to think what else. Sometimes living wills will have specific things about, you know, whether or not you want to have specific surgeries, whether or not you want to donate organs, all, you know, basically anything that can have to do with end-of-life decisions or medical decisions, especially high-ranking medical decisions, are going to be in that document. Next thing we need to understand is what are do not resuscitate orders. This is usually a part of a living will. Do not resuscitate orders, directives placed in the medical chart that prevent heroic measures and allow patients to die as a result of disease or injury. This, guys, can cause some serious problems. Because as you can imagine, there have been cases where somebody has a DNR in their medical chart and something goes wrong. And maybe it's just a very temporary electrolyte problem. Maybe their blood chemistry gets out of whack. According to this DNR, they're not to do any kind of heroic measures. They're not to really to put a lot of time and energy into you, even though the doctors and nurses may look at you and realize, hey, we can fix this. And so sometimes it puts them in the ethical quandary of, do I fix this, knowing this person can continue to live a healthy life, or do I obey what's in the medical chart? And then you get into the whole question of what is considered heroic, what is not heroic. So some of the stuff we're talking about here is not as clean cut and easy to figure out as they would like us to believe. Artificial feeding is the next one. Most of us know this tube feeding procedure provides patients with artificial nutrition. Normally it is a tube that is placed in one of three places. It can be put through your nose directly into your stomach. So you see, sometimes you'll see cancer patients that have an NG tube. The second is a straight G tube, which means it goes through your abdomen into your stomach. And the third is a jejunal tube, which goes into the jejunal junction of your small intestines. So, long story short, this is a person who otherwise probably healthy, but they are requiring nutrients in order to continue living. One of the things that you can kind of take a little bit of ease and comfort in, if you or somebody you love has ever raced into an emergency room, one of the things that they will not have to worry with right away is this idea of tube feeding. Because this is something that's put in days, if not weeks later, after they've stabilized you. Because, guys, think about it for just a moment. They can put an IV bag that's got sugar water in it, and they can give you enough calories for several days before the whole nutrition thing really kicks in. So tube feeding is something that comes in after you're stabilized, after they realize this is going to be a long-term kind of deal. What about Glasgow Coma Scale? So we talked about somebody being in a coma. Here's basically the three determinants that they look at. They look at the eye-opening verbal responses and motor responses, and you get scored. Basically, I think it's 1 to 13 or 1 to 15 as to how well you do. So in other words, if you have no eye-opening, you're given a low score. If you have no verbal response, you're given a low score. If you have a low motor response, you're given a low score. Each one of these is given a score, let's see, I think it's 1 to 5, and they add all three of them up. So basically, the highest you can get is a 15. That means you're awake, intact, doing well. If you get a 3, that's not really good. That means that basically you are on about the same level as your Thanksgiving turkey. All right, with all of those in mind, somebody tell me what Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27 says.
(9:27).
Yes, sir.
Inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment.
Okay. So God has appointed a time for every single person to die. Now let's think about that for just a moment in context of everything that we're talking about here. As Christians, we should not fear or shun death. In fact, we should be preparing for a heavenly homecoming. I think it's sad that realistically most Christians, we when it comes to death, we do everything in our power to kind of get away from it, to fight it, to put it off. When if we really truly are living a Christian life and we know what our destination is going to be, it should not bother us in the slightest. Why do you think most Christians fear death?
They're not right with God.
Unknown.
Okay. They're not right. What else?
Talking about why most Christians would fear death?
Yeah.
Fear of the unknown.
Okay. Fear of the unknown, I buy that a little bit.
Because
What else?
Lack of preparation.
I would say a lack of assurance.
Okay, and that's the one I have the biggest problem with.
Yes.
Because does the Bible not indicate that we can know whether or not we have eternal life. Absolutely it does. And so if you don't know that, or if the people in your congregation don't know that, guys, we got problems, because literally as you're sitting there right now, you should know where you're going. Every time I board a plane, I know where I'm going. Now, I'd like for the plane to land, but if it doesn't, so be it. Not a big deal. I think far too often, somebody read me 1 John chapter 5, verse 13.
These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know that you have eternal life.
So that you may know. First thing you've got to do when you are giving counsel or when you are teaching someone in this area, you got to make sure that they, first off, are good in the sight of God, and then second, that they can know that they have that confidence. Because basically what they're going to want is something you can't give them, and that is assurance. The only person that can really give them assurance is themselves, because only they know where they are in the sight of God. What I want to do for a few minutes is I want us to talk about basically application of all of this. Because I suspect, even though it kind of may freak you out, I suspect in your lifetime, all of you in that room are going to have somebody come to you and say, hey, my so-and-so is sick, or my grandmother is on a respirator, or my daughter just got hit by a car. What should I do? In order to answer that particular question, I want us to start with something that we actually look at a lot of times in the evolution area, and that is the law of cause and effect. The law of cause and effect basically says this: for every material cause, there must be an adequate, or for every material effect, there must be an adequate cause that existed prior to it. Now, if you look up on the screen right now, hopefully, if we use this same thing when talking about making decisions, it's going to make it a whole lot easier for us to know what is the right decision. In other words, is the person going to die naturally as the effect of some disease or injury, or is their death going to be caused by some effect or decision that a family member or you make? Does everybody understand this slide? Because we're not moving on until you got this one down. In other words, is that person going to meet their fate as a result of something that happened to them, or is that person going to meet their fate because of something you did, or maybe a surrogate decision that you made?
I have a question.
Absolutely.
Going back to your illustration at the beginning of class.
Yes.
When we decide to put a feeding tube in,
Yep.
then we have no real choices after that as to whether it can come out unless that person becomes brain dead.
That's right. Because, Chuck, if you pull that tube, what is going to be the effect?
They're going to die.
They're going to die of what?
Starvation.
Specifically.
Or dehydration.
Dehydration, starvation. Usually lasts somewhere between 7 and 11 days, and it is a very, very ugly way to die. But their death is going to be the direct result of a decision that you made. All right, let's keep going here. Prior to the 1960s, physicians made a majority of decisions regarding particular. Yeah.
Hey, Brad, will you explain what the law of cause and effect is one more time, the definition?
Sure. For every material effect, there must be an adequate cause that existed prior to it. And the reason I'm using it in the field of ethics is because we want to look at what is, if you're having to make decisions for this person, whether it be a family member or whether you are giving counsel as a preacher, you want to make sure that whatever advice you give, whatever counsel you give, does not bring about the effects of that person's death, does not cause that person's death.
Okay.
Prior to the 1960s, physicians made the majority of decisions, and yet just within my lifetime, guys, that has changed dramatically. If you think about it, the internet has really basically put physicians in a whole new category because patients can go online and they can read about their own disease. And in some cases, there have been times where I've seen people who were diagnosed with something. Take something like a lupus, for example. They spend 3 or 4 weeks of intensive research online. They go back into their doctor's office, and guys, in some cases, you've now got a patient that is maybe better up to date than the doctor is. And so this has really kind of caused a shift in who gets to make the decisions. It used to be the doctor would say, this is what we're going to do. And it was kind of like, period, done. Now we've got loved ones that help out. You've got preachers that are giving counsel. All kinds of different things that are going into what is the final decision for the patient. But as we think about that, we've got to go back and we've got to remember that life is a gift, period, from God. Paul recorded by Luke, noted that we are the offspring of God in Acts chapter 17, verse 28. Romans chapter 14, verse 8, writing to the Christians in Rome, Paul noted, for whether we live unto the Lord, whether we die unto the Lord, whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. In other words, no matter what circumstance, I am going to, first and foremost, be a servant of God's. And I'm not going to violate my Christian principles in order to change either my life or death status or anything. The very next verse, therefore we must respect the integrity of life processes that God created from birth to death, since Christ is Lord of both the dead and the living. All right, so we know as Christians we've got to honor the sanctity of life. Let's look at how it's changed just within our lifetime. 1967, a guy by the name of Louis Kuttner, he proposed a written document that allowed a person to express his or her treatment wishes. He called it a living will. That was back in 67, guys. So this is a relatively new thing. 10 years later, 1976, California became the first state to enact a law called the Natural Death Act, recognizing the validity of an advance directive. That's 1976. 1990, the Patient Self-Determination Act was passed by Congress as an amendment to the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, requiring all healthcare facilities that receive federal funds to ask every single patient as they come in, do you have an advance directive? So when you guys, let's say you break a leg or you sprain an ankle, if you go into a facility that gets federal funds, which most of them do, by law, they have to ask you now, normally it's in your admission papers when you sign in, you give them your insurance information, you fill out a HIPAA card about who gets information about you. Usually in that same packet of papers, there's something that says, I have an advance directive or I don't have an advance directive. Why do you think the government has stepped in on this particular topic?
Well, that's a loaded question.
What do you think?
One thing is that they feel that taking care of people that are on feeding tubes and stuff, they're running up hospital bills and
there no?
I'm sure whatever it is, it's hooked to money.
Cost.
Absolutely. And guys, understand, we are facing a possible government healthcare plan. I don't know where you are with it, don't really care where you are with it, but I do know this. It scares me, the fact that we've got the best right now, and our government is fixing to tinker with it, when so far as I can see, anytime the government tries to tinker with stuff, whether it be IRS, whether it be the Department of Motor Vehicles, whether it be Post Office, anything they do is so bogged down in red tape and inefficient and nuts that you can sell them a hammer for $27,000. It tells me we may have some bigger problems. And whoever just mentioned the fact that, you know, you got older people who may be kicked out, while we don't like to talk about it, that's a very real possibility. Basically what they would do is start with what's called a quality of life scale. And if you aren't up to scale, in other words, if you haven't reached a certain percentage, then the government basically says, you know what, we're just going to treat you for pain, but we're not actually going to treat you. I'll give you the prime example. A very close friend of mine recently, within the last week, has had open heart surgery. Had 5 bypasses and a mitral valve replaced. Now, this is a gentleman who is up in years. He's in his 70s. If this thing goes to our government, more than likely, he would have been viewed as being basically too old for an elective surgery like that. Because after all, they're mentally thinking, how much longer has this guy really got? Why would we spend $100,000 here when we could farm it out down here? And so it's, when you really start thinking about kind of where we are, it should be a little nerve-wracking. Dean?
While we're on the topic of right to life and stuff like that, there have been things in the news, and I don't know whether it's just hype or whether there's any fact behind it, but what do you know as far as this whole death panel thing that people have been talking about?
Well, I'll be honest, they won't ever show the finalized bill. Or let me restate that. We don't have a finalized bill yet. 2 of the bills that I've seen did have what we would call a death panel, which would basically be physicians and governmental agents who would dictate certain conditions that they viewed as no longer being treatable. So, for instance, if you were 4th stage of certain cancers, or if you were suffering from certain traumatic disorders, or whether you had certain intracranial pressure in your brain, the government and these doctors would come together and they would basically say, these are the ones that we're going to pay for, these are the ones we won't. Until they actually sign off on the final bill, nobody's going to know if that's actually in there or not. It's one of the nasty little things about the way our government is running right now is they're slipping things in and out, and everybody gets upset one minute, and then we forget about it for a week or two, and it's kind of like, okay, you know, what's actually going on here? Let me tell you one thing that I know is happening that you should be aware of, and the reason I can say this because it affected me personally. My medical class started out with about 155 medical students. Half of those are no longer practicing medicine. Now, the reason I tell you that is these are guys who have either gone back and gotten an MBA, they're working in computers, they're doing something. The point is, people don't want to go into the field of medicine anymore. They're still accepting classes of 150 every year, so what do you think that's doing to the overall standard?
Going down, boy.
Where you used to have a 3.5, 3.8 to get in, is steadily coming down, meaning they are accepting less qualified students today. People who are getting into medical school today, there's no way they could have gotten in 10, 15, 20 years ago because their grades wouldn't have been high enough. And so the standard of care is already starting to slowly trickle down. All right, let's keep rolling. All right, we've talked a little bit about living will, advanced directives. Both of them refer to a legal agreement that gives somebody the authority to make medical decisions for another person. Legal terms vary from state to state. Beware the term that you use. And this is the question that I asked James Coker a minute ago. Many right-to-life supporters suspect that advanced directives are merely a method of right-to-die advocates. Because words like comfort, dignity are employed, they fear that over time procedures like euthanasia will be worked into the forms. But we need to understand the forms themselves are not inherently bad. Somebody tell me the biggest problem with these forms.
Say that again.
What's the biggest problem with these forms, with an advanced directive or a living will?
Well, you're not around to enforce it yourself.
There you go. If I go out today, guys, and I'm in a car wreck, and I'm life-flighted to Vanderbilt Hospital, do I have my living will on me?
No.
No, absolutely not. So here's what happens in too many cases, guys. Somebody that is younger than, let's say, 65, if you are in a traumatic accident or whatever, they treat you first, and then once you're stabilized, they go out and talk to the family and ask, what would you like done? Do this person have a living will? So it's basically, they see it as their view for the first few hours to save life under any condition. Well, in many cases, that may mean including putting you on machines. So now you got this double-edged sword where I was flown into Vanderbilt, I'm on these machines, but I've got a living will that says I don't want to be on machines. So now my wife has got to make this horrible decision, even though realistically I've already made it, so it's not that big a deal.
So they only
So
made
unless-
for. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, they're a lot more effective for older people, because if you think about it, older people go to the doctor more often. Their physicians are more in tune with what their desires are. So if an older person gets diagnosed with something, they can let everybody know ahead of time, look, here's what I want. But in younger people who die normally from more acute injuries or traumatic injuries, they're not as nearly as effective because you don't have it with you.
Wait. So Brad.
Unless you tattoo it to your chest.
You said that, in fact, it doesn't really matter because you've already made the decision, right?
Right.
So are you saying that if your wife does go ahead and pull the feeding tube, if you said you don't want a feeding tube, that she's now responsible, you are?
No, see, okay, first off, the feeding tube decision wouldn't have to be made in a realistic situation because they're not going to put that in for days, if not weeks.
Okay.
This would be a situation where she comes to the hospital an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours later, or even 12, 15, 24 hours later. I'm still on IV bags. They ain't worried about feeding tubes. So all she has to do at that stage is say, what is he hooked up to? Here's what he said he wanted. And she doesn't even have to make the feeding tube call.
Okay, so that's so any form of life support.
My living will actually says any extraordinary means.
Okay. How is that defined?
Defined as, like, if I were to be put on a respirator and need it for more than a month to assist me in breathing, that would be considered extraordinary.
Here's my question, though.
Okay?
If that machine is turned off,
Yes.
you're going to die. Correct?
Yes.
If
Yes.
that machine is left on, you're going to live.
possibly, yes.
Okay. How's
I see where you're going.
How's it
I see where you're going.
thing?
I see where you're going, Chris, and here's the point. That's why it's important, if you really don't want the machines on in the first place, that somebody knows that.
Right.
That's why an advanced directive or a living will is no good if you get in trouble, all of a sudden you're messed up, and they've already hooked all this stuff up to you. That's not a good thing.
Right, but what I'm saying is, so let's suppose if somebody doesn't get that, they don't see it,
Yeah.
or somebody takes too long getting into the hospital.
Then I think as a Christian, you have a responsibility to uphold the sanctity of life. Always. Always, always, always.
Okay, so, what I'm saying is, if it gets there, your living will, it gets there,
Okay?
and the machine's already hooked up. Is it unethical? Is it sinful? Is it not respecting the sanctity of your life to do what you've asked to be done?
Well, here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen in that situation, more than likely. In that situation, my wife would not be consulted. It would take the burden of her ever having to make a life or death decision, a cause and effect decision, off of her. Because the doctors have a legal document that they are now bound to.
So the doctors are guilty of not respecting the sanctity of life.
Absolutely.
So the doctors are sinning. How can the wife then, in good conscience, allow the doctors to go ahead and sin like that?
My wife wouldn't. She's already told me. She's going to keep me. My wife wants to be kept alive until every cell in her body starts to turn to dirt. She's told me she wants me to come read to her and play certain songs and all these kind of things. She's one of those that, until the last breath is out, I want everything done that can be done. Likewise, if I'm ever in that shape, even though I've expressed my wishes, she's probably going to do the same to me.
Okay, so let's suppose that you have a wife who doesn't like you that much. I guess. I mean, do you see where I'm? It comes down. To ultimately, is it right or is it wrong? And who's making the call? And if I know that a doctor's going to be doing something that is sinful, how can I allow that to happen?
Do you, as a Christian, have to take advantage of every medical technology that's out there?
Nope.
Okay. You've answered the question.
Right.
So if you have expressed your wishes and you say, I would prefer to die of natural causes if I'm in a car wreck or a skiing accident or whatever.
Correct.
You have that ability.
Right. But if those tubes get hooked up to me before that document gets to the hospital, and then somebody's now put in a position where they have to decide whether or not to leave me hooked up to those machines or pull them out.
If
somebody pulls them out once they're already in, that they're guilty of sin.
It's the doctor, or like if you have somebody who has power of attorney over you, they are legally acting for you.
Right. That's secular law, though.
So then you would be sinning if but you just said you feel like we don't have to. Basically, all you're doing is that person is acting through you.
Right. Whether that's your wife or whether it's your doctor.
Right.
Okay.
And you just told me you don't have to take advantage of every medical technology.
Right. So that would include things like feeding tubes.
We're going in circles here, brother.
I know it.
I'm waiting for you to get it.
I know what you're saying. I just don't. Well, yeah.
Okay, let's try it one last time, Chris.
Oh, goodness.
You say that Christians do not have to take advantage of every medical technology. I agree. Because let's be honest, medical technology is for man. Man is not all wise. That we've done some stupid things in the past, like the Tuskegee syphilis incident. Not everything we do is wise.
Correct.
So we don't have to take advantage of everything. if I have put it down on a legal form that I have,
Yes.
then nobody's making a decision. You're acting like somebody is sinning. Nobody's
not.
making the decision because I already have.
I agree with that.
Okay.
So cool.
All right. Very nice. We're rolling. Well, all right. Somebody tell me what a person should do in cases of coma.
I have no idea after that.
Wait, keep him alive.
Wait. Why?
Because it's not a permanent thing.
It's not a permanent thing. Brain is probably bruised and swelling. We wait and see what happens when the swelling goes down.
Right.
We make good, wise, slow decisions where we do things like pray, where we try to treat them for pain. What about this one?
Wait.
How long do we wait?
6 to 12 months.
6 to 12 months. And then they say, okay, yep, your wife does have PBS. Then what do you say?
What did she said in her living will?
Guys, that doesn't matter.
What stage? Okay. Oh, she's brain dead. If she's brain dead, then bury her.
She's not brain dead. She's persistent vegetative state. Two different things. You better know it for the test.
Wait.
Persistent vegetative state means I still got loads of brain activity.
Okay.
Wait.
She wait.
Can I kill this person?
Oh.
No.
Can you ask it that way on a test? That'd be.
So here we got a normal brain cross section. There's a brain of somebody that's got, for instance, that has been in a persistent vegetative state. What's the difference?
Mass. Your holes.
Yeah, you got areas that are missing, or that have been basically that have died off. But what I want you to notice is what is still there.
Brain.
You still got brain tissue, guys. Which means you still have neural activity going on. In fact, one of the coolest studies that they've done, and this is only in the last year and a half, they took a dude into a MRI.
That's medical.
That's a nice.
I'll wait until y'all are ready. They put electrodes on his brain. Now this is a guy who is in a persistent vegetative state, not locked in. He is out like Terry Schiavo. Can't communicate. They basically said, imagine playing tennis. So he's in an MRI, he's got electrodes on. All of a sudden, his brain activity starts mimicking a ball going back and forth across a net. And when they tell him to stop, it stops. So even though he cannot physically communicate with him, he is still there. The classic case would be a guy by the name of Gary Dockery. He was 7.5 years. He was in a persistent vegetative state and came out of it. So imagine for just a moment, you've got somebody that you love who's in a state like that, and 7 years later, 7.5 years later, they come out. That's huge.
Yeah.
That means for 7.5 years, this guy was in a bed, not communicating with anybody.
Now,
Go ahead.
What's the difference in that and in locked-in syndrome, then?
Remember, locked in, they're perfectly conscious. They just cannot communicate.
They can hear you talking bad about them.
So their eyes open up and.
Okay,
They can, eyes open up in some state. And locked in, normally it is not as major of a brain disorder so much as it is getting out. So, like in persistent vegetative state, in almost all those cases, you've got brain damage of some sort. And remember I told you guys last week, brain damage is not a single diagnosis. It's a spectrum. So you can have mild brain damage, or you can have literally whole sides of the brain that have gone away and are now filled in with cerebral spinal fluid. Well, the PVS that we're talking about, this dude who's playing tennis, he's got brain damage. He can't communicate. But now they know that he's there, that there's something still up there. Because when they put him in this MRI, they hook him up, and they say, imagine playing tennis. Lo and behold, the dude's brain activity starts changing.
So they can still hear you talking to him and stuff.
That's the next step, is they're going to try to figure out if they can get a way for him to communicate back to them using brain activity.
So like with electrodes or whatever?
Well, imagine this. They tell the guy cannot blink. They can't say blink twice for yes, once for no. But if they say, imagine blinking, and they can get a response, they can record that activity as a yes or no and say, okay, blink twice for yes, once for no, and they can actually see that as they're communicating with this guy. It is phenomenal. Basically what they're proving is this person is fully alive, and they're in there, they just can't get out. They've had so much damage they can't get out.
And that's PBS, that's not even persistent, that's not even locked in, right?
Right. Chuck?
I'm looking at one of the questions on a living will, and
Yep.
and it looks like it can be really confusing because they don't define terms clearly.
Okay.
Do you want to receive life-sustaining treatment if you are in a permanent unconscious condition with no hope of recovery and unable to communicate in any way? But it defines a permanent unconscious condition as an incurable and irreversible condition with no reasonable probability of recovery from a coma or PVS.
Okay, now let's talk about that. Problem with that is, how do they know it's irreversible?
Right.
Gary Dockery, 7.5 years he came out of it. Second thing is, how do you know that person is not locked in? Because locked-in syndrome is exactly the same as what you just read. I mean, it presents the same as what you just read. So if you sign that as it's worded, and you happen to have some traumatic injury that causes you to be locked in, you are going to listen and watch as they pull the plug and kill you. Not exactly a warm and fuzzy feeling. All right, I'm going to read a little bit of something to you guys. Y'all don't have this one, but take a listen. 17-year-old girl woke up and said, "Mom, I love you," according to the New England Journal of Medicine. These were the words written and said by a 17-year-old girl who, for more than 15 months following a car accident, was in a persistent vegetative state. After 15 months, nurses started noticing rare and inconsistent responses to certain commands. 3 years after the injury, she communicated using eye blinks for yes and no. 5 years after the injury, she could follow conversations and was communicating by mouthing words or short phrases. The article noted she enjoyed pampering. Her mood was usually euphoric. She had no behavioral evidence of depression or despondency over her deficits. She enjoyed humor, making jokes, teasing her caregivers. While she remained wheelchair-bound, totally dependent for her care, the young lady was discharged and allowed to return home 5 years after the injury. There's one. The guy that I just told you about, Gary Dockery. Let me find him. Here we go. Let's see. Christians should not prematurely terminate the life of somebody in PVS. In fact, family members who have to struggle with watching their loved ones exist in a state far removed from their previous existence may take offense at that suggestion. After all, they're the ones that have to bathe, feed, turn, change, and tend to an individual. Guys, when you tell somebody, hey, you can't pull the plug, you need to understand you're not just telling them you can't pull the plug. You're telling them that their life cannot go on as normal anymore, ever again, because they are now going to be caring for that person in sickness and health. And by that I mean you got men who may want to get remarried. Well, you've got a living spouse there. You got people who may want to be working, and all of a sudden you've got somebody that you're going to need to tend to, at least have somebody care for. Here we go. Seeing their loved ones so helpless has led many to subscribe to the mantra that those in a vegetative state have no quality of life, that there's not a person there. Rather, it's just a body that is simply a functioning corpse and not a living person. How then would one explain the awakening of Gary Dockery after 7.5 years in persistent vegetative state? Upon awakening, he talked for 18 hours, recalling family members' names of pets. Or what about the 18-year-old girl who remained in a persistent vegetative state 2.5 years following a traffic accident? She then began to show signs of responsiveness. 6 years after the accident, she was able to comprehend and communicate. And according to her doctors, she shows considerable interest in her surroundings. She's able to establish interpersonal relationships. Moreover, the improvement is continuing. Because as this person starts to wake up, their brain starts to figure out workarounds that will help them. All right. Other thoughts, questions, comments before we keep rolling? All right, let's look at a couple of cases together. Carrie Quinlan, you do need to know this particular little case. Let's see. (1976) Supreme Court ruled the state had no right to order that she remain on a respirator. U.S. Supreme Court had never heard the case, so no national precedent was established. State Supreme Court appointed Joseph Quinlan as Karen's guardian, ruled that whatever decision he made should be accepted by society, the overwhelming majority of whose numbers would, we think, in similar circumstances, exercise such a choice in the same way for themselves or for those closest to it. So you got a New Jersey State Supreme Court that ruled that the state had no right to order whether she remained on a respirator or not. This one was not heard by the Supreme Court. This was kind of the beginning. That's where you can find the court decisions. I'm not going to... You guys can take a look at it if you want to. Another one that you do need to be aware of is the Cruzan case, C-R-U-Z-A-N. This one did go to the Supreme Court. Nancy Cruzan, incompetent. Petitioner Nancy Cruzan is incompetent, having sustained severe injuries in an automobile accident. Now lies in a Missouri State Hospital that is referred to as a persistent vegetative state. Generally a condition in which the person exhibits motor reflexes, no indications of significant cognitive function. State is bearing the cost of her care. Hospital employees refused, without court approval, to honor the request of Cruzan's parents. Co-petitioners here to terminate her artificial nutrition, since that would result in the death. State trial court authorized the termination, finding that a person Cruzan's condition has fundamental right under the state and federal constitutions to direct or refuse the withdrawal of death-prolonging procedures. So here's what they found. The Supreme Court reversed the lower court's decision. Court then decided the state living will statute embodied a state policy strongly favoring the preservation of life. Cruzan's statements of her housemate were unreliable for the purpose of determining her intent. In other words, she told her housemate what she wanted. Rejected the argument that her parents were entitled to order the termination of her medical treatment, concluding that no person can assume the choice for an incompetent in the absence of formalities required by living will statute or clear and convincing evidence of the patient's wishes. In other words, this was one of those deals that made living wills and advance directives extremely important. Look at another one. This is Washington versus Glucksberg. 3 terminally ill patients sued the state of Washington claiming its laws against physician-assisted suicide violated their 14th Amendment right to due process. 1997, state Supreme Court agreed with the plaintiffs. U.S. Supreme Court ruled against them, maintaining the long-standing public disapproval of suicide even when near death. They alleged the right to commit assisted suicide is not a fundamental liberty that is protected by due process. The ban on assisted suicide can be rationally related to legitimate government interests such as preventing murders, abuse of the elderly. 2 more. Vaco versus Quill. Quill, oncologist, deeply concerned about his clients, some of whom are likely to die slow. Suit was brought on behalf of 3 dying patients, arguing the New York State prohibited assisted suicide. Supreme Court ruled that New York's law did not violate equal protection guarantees of the Constitution. Long story short, it went to several different briefs before the Supreme Court filed a project on death in America. And let's see. Last but not least, and this is the one that we're going to spend the most time on, obviously, today. Terry Schiavo case. Probably the most famous life and death case of the 21st century. About 8 months ago, I had the chance to talk to Terry's brother. We did an interview for Think Magazine. And I'm going to show you some of the timeline, and then we're going to watch a video together. Understand, guys, when I put this video up there, it's not so you can sleep or check out mentally. It's so that you'll actually watch, because some of it will be on the test. She was born in 1963. She got married 1984 to Michael Schiavo. They moved to St. Petersburg in 1986. 1990, she suffered cardiac arrest. A lot of confusion, a lot of discussion about what caused it. Some folks are saying that it was caused by the fact that she was not eating right, that she was bulimic or anorexic. And whether or not that's true doesn't really matter. Bottom line is she did have a cardiac arrest. May of 1990, she was discharged from the hospital. She was taken to a skilled care rehabilitation facility. That's an important step, because if you go to a rehab facility, what is the mental implication?
That they want to live recover.
That you're going to get at least some better, right? All right, so that's May 12, 1990. Keep watching the timeline. June of that year, court appoints Michael as her guardian. So her husband becomes her guardian. That's obviously what we would expect. Parents don't object. She's transferred now to Bayfront Hospital. More rehabilitation efforts. September of that year, the family brings her home, but 3 weeks later they return her because the family's overwhelmed by her needs. Michael Schiavo takes her to California for experimental brain stimulation. Things are moving along pretty good. She's actually starting to communicate a little bit. 1991, she is transferred to Sable Plum Skilled Care Facility. She still is getting testing. She's getting aggressive speech and occupational therapy. So do you see a pattern? Basically, they are doing everything they can to try to get this young lady as much care as she can get. Now, notice May of 1992. May 1992, the parents and the husband stopped living together. Why? It probably had to do with something that happened in August that was already obviously in the makings in May. In August, Shivo's awarded $250,000 out-of-court medical malpractice settlement by one of her physicians. November, she gets $1 million settlement, basically saying they did not do enough when she first went in the hospital. So now she's sitting on $1.25 million, and all of a sudden, February, Michael Shivo and the Schindlers have a falling out over the course of therapy. July 29th of 93, they attempt to remove Michael as her guardian. Court dismisses the case. We move a year later. March of 94, and obviously, guys, I have this on the iDesk later today. They assign a guardian ad litem who submits his report, states Michael Shivo has acted appropriately, attentively towards Ms. Shivo. 4 years go by. He petitions the court to remove her feeding tube. 1998, December, issues a report which he concludes Ms. Shivo is in a persistent vegetative state with no chance of improvement. Michael Shivo's decision-making may be influenced by potential to inherit the remainder of her estate. In other words, if he takes the tube out, what's he automatically gonna get?
1.2 million.
1.2 mil. February 11th, Judge Greer rules Ms. Shivo would have chosen to remove the tube, therefore he orders it removed, which took cause death in 7 to 14 days. So that's February. March 18th. It's removed in mid-afternoon. This is actually the third time that it had been removed. And we'll see on the video, like, basically they take it out, they go to the courts, it gets put back in. They take it out, they go to the politicians, it gets put back in. Finally, March 18th, it got taken out for good. And she died roughly 13 days later. Here's an interesting thing, and I didn't put this on there. Well, to me, one of the most telling of all this is her husband was knowingly sleeping with somebody else.
Oh my goodness.
So he had already basically moved on in his life. The parents basically say, look, that's fine, we understand, you're young, you want to move on. Give us permission to take care of her. Give us the power of attorney over Terry. He would not do that simply because the minute he did that, guess what happens?
The money goes away.
With power of attorney, the money would default to the parents. If they divorced, he would have absolutely no inheritance in their money. Here's some things that basically kind of came up during the case. You know, was she really there? Is a person there? Is there any reasonable hope for recovery? So here's what I want us to do. Wayne, can I get you to start the video now, and then with the understanding we're going to have to stop it in about 15 minutes when they take a break. And then when they come back from break, we'll start it back.
Okay, we're ready to go now?
We are. And if you need to, like, mute me or whatever with me, that's fine.
I think you'll be fine.
So basically, when it comes down to it, everything has to do revolve around money.
Watch this, hey guys, this is the best documentary I've ever seen on it. It was actually done by a outfit real close to my house called Franklin Springs. They try to put out good quality, quote unquote, Christian stuff. Several scenes in this are extremely powerful.
Okay, I'm all ready if you are, Brad, and if you want to
Yep, go ahead.
Pause it.
Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Ken Carpenter, and welcome to this Franklin Springs Family Media special presentation. Several of us here at Franklin Springs have greatly enjoyed the privilege of working on a new television series with Johnny Harrison Tata. We've traveled around the country gathering stories of hope and redemption and resilience. There's been a thread of strong family life in the stories we've told, and there's also been a very consistent affirmation of the value of every human life. There's one story in the series that puts this into especially clear focus, and that's the story of Terry Schindler Shibo. Our hope and prayer is that this special two-part episode challenges you and ultimately encourages you to consider anew the biblical worldview that this story commands. Enjoy the show. There were two people who could have saved Terry's life. The husband and that original judge.
Do we believe in the sanctity of all human life, or do we believe in the sanctity of some human life?
By order of the government, a healthy young woman was denied food and water until she died. It's unthinkable.
Our only intention from the beginning was to simply bring Terry home and care for her. We're in a country that has a system of justice. We don't have justice. What did the media miss? The truth about Terry and the moral insanity of the situation.
Here's, I think, the bottom line. Terry Shibo suffered from a severe cognitive disability. She was not terminal. This mere fact alone ought to give one pause.
In this very special two-part Johnny and Friends, we are going to revisit a story that many of us think we already know. The story of Terry Shibo. Though much has been said about this complicated legal battle over the death of this severely disabled woman, it remains confusing to many, and as a result, critical lessons have been lost. During the 14 years of Terry's disability, emotions ran high as a family's private struggle to save their loved one eventually came under the harsh glare of a worldwide media spotlight. The key is nobody wants to be disabled, but once you become impaired, it is amazing how precious life becomes. And as the Bible tells us time and again, God cares for and He nurtures life, no matter how damaged that life is, because we bear His image. Well, in this episode, we are going to go right to the heart of the story. You are going to meet the Schindler family and hear their candid, first-hand account of how and why they fought so hard to save Terry's life. And we will hear uncomfortable accounts of the horrific manner in which Terry died. We will hear from experts who will distinguish critically important issues from the hysteria surrounding the public debate, and we will dig deep beneath the media hype. We will try to shed light on the difficult but critical ethical issues Terry's case raised, issues that directly affect thousands of families affected by disability every day, and may be affecting yours right now. And lest we forget, at the center of this raging controversy that played out on television around the world in 2005 was a very real family wrestling the very real life and death questions of right and wrong in the eyes of God. At the very eye of that storm, in a hospice bed in St. Petersburg, Florida, locked inside a body that did not work and a tragically damaged frame, lay one very alive and very human disabled woman, Terry Schindler-Scheibe.
We lived in the same apartment complex, and we would go out frequently. In fact, she had come over that evening. I had asked her if she wanted to go out with us, me and my roommate. She said no, that she had been fighting with Michael all day, and she was going to go home and wait for him to get home from work. Michael was in the restaurant business and was a manager, so he would work nights. So I said, okay, and she left.
We were sleeping and the phone rang, and it was Michael. And he told Bob that something happened to Terry, that she fainted. And Bob said to him, did you call 911? And he said, no. And he said, well, hang up right now and call.
And I got a call from my father. I forget exactly what time it was, but it was early in the morning. I said to get over your sisters, something's happened. And when I got into the apartment, Terry was lying face down into the carpeting. And it was at that time the paramedics or the EMT came through the door and started to attend to her, and that's when I realized just how serious the problem was.
So he called us up and he said, Mom, you better get to the hospital. He said, they just took Terry to the hospital. And when we got there, it was very bad.
The first few days, it was touch and go. We didn't know whether Terry was going to live or not. From her collapse, she suffered a lack of oxygen to her brain and suffered profound brain injury. And she remained dependent on others for her care just at night.
Does the new medicine require a new morality? Now, there are many new questions that have been raised by the new technology. What happens when a person becomes suddenly incapacitated and hasn't made their wishes known? What is a person? What defines personhood? When there is a family dispute, who should decide and what criteria should be used? I think those are the fundamental issues. Terry Scheibe, we know, had her nutrition and hydration withdrawn in March of '05. But there are many in her position right now. Well, how do we think about it? How do we think about them? Are they persons or are they not?
For most of us who first met Terry Scheibe through TV news coverage, what we just saw is where her story begins. A mysterious fall, a stopped heart, and severe brain damage. But for Bob and Mary Schindler, the story began in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on December 3rd, 1963, with the birth of their first daughter, Teresa Marie. Terry Schindler, the first of 3 children in this close-knit family.
Well, when I got married, I knew I wanted as many kids as I could have. And I was a stay-at-home mom. My dad worked. However, he was home on the weekends. He had a normal job. And my mother, though, was, she devoted her life to her kids, her children. She did not work outside the home. And everything revolved around us. She would be the one to drive us everywhere. We also belonged to a swim club, so in the summer, we would go to the swim club.
We grew up in just a real typical, I guess you can describe it as a middle-class family. We're all very close. We went through the parochial school system.
We had a lot of fun. We were very family-oriented. It was a happy time growing up for all of them, I think.
This was one close family. Like the Bible says, children are a blessing from the Lord. And for the Schindlers, each of their 3 children were valued.
I remember a lot of Terry and Bobby romping around together. They were very close in age, about 13 months apart. And I was always the little sister wanting to see what they were doing. What are you doing now? Can I play?
She had an overwhelming compassion for animals. I don't ever remember her not having this love for animals. Her room was filled with stuffed animals. So like my dad compared it to a zoo.
She drew very well. She was an excellent artist, and she drew animals, of course, because that was her favorite. So she was very free spirit, very loving.
She was very protective of her family. Just had an overwhelming love for her grandparents. Terry was shy growing up. She wasn't real outgoing, outside of the family.
Terry had a little weight problem, just a little, and I used to take her to the pediatrician, and he'd say, when she's ready, when she's ready, she'll tell you, and then I'll help her, but not until. And when she graduated from high school, she said, Mom, I'd like to lose some weight. So we went to see the pediatrician, and he told her what to do, and she did.
She had lost weight when she got into college and started to attract men, and Michael was the first person that asked her out, and she ended up marrying him.
After Terry and Michael married, they moved to Florida to live close to Bob and Mary Schindler, who had retired to St. Petersburg. As the young couple settled into their new life and Michael was welcomed into the extended Schindler family, they could scarcely have known the tragic events which would begin to unfold just 4 years later.
Initially, after Terry's collapse, we were all working together with Michael and our family, trying to do everything we could to help Terry to improve conditions.
She was in hospitals, and then she was in nursing homes, and then she went to California to put the implant in her head, see if that would help. And when she came back here, she went to a rehab center down in Bradenton.
Doctors believed that she was a candidate for rehabilitation therapy, so we started aggressively doing that, providing her the therapy and rehabilitation that doctors recommended that she needed, and she was improving.
And that's when she was starting to talk down there, stop, mommy, okay, little things.
The first couple of years, after 1990, after her collapse, there are notes in her medical files where nurses were writing that Terry was starting to speak. She was forming words from her rehabilitation, and she was getting better. And we were very encouraged by that.
After a hopeful beginning, circumstances developed that quickly clouded the cooperation between Terry's family and Michael Scheibo.
A friend of his was an attorney, suggested that he go after Terry's physicians and blame them for Terry's collapse. So they sued Terry's physicians, and it went to trial in the fall of 1992. Michael was suing for $20 million. Now, you have to remember during this time, we were all working together to help Terry. There was an award in the millions of dollars, and that money was awarded to Terry for her future rehabilitation and therapy. And Michael clearly stated in his testimony that he wanted to do everything he could to help Terry.
So he gets $1 million, and all of a sudden, therapy stops.
So Terry could really, when this first happened to her, we used to take her to the mall. We took her in wheelchair transport to the mall. We had her hair done. Michael and I used to take her a lot of places. The museum. And to this day, how my daughter was, she could be going with us anywhere.
It was at that time, Michael just did a complete flip-flop.
We saw him at the nursing home. Bob had asked him, now that we got the money, he said, you promised to take Terry to Gainesville and start giving her rehab. And he just exploded. He said that it was his wife who would do what he wanted to do for her. We had nothing to say. And if we all sat there and said, we'll never, ever see our daughter again.
From that point on, it was in the beginning of 1993, just after the malpractice trial, that it became a fight to do anything to help Terry. She was denied any and all rehabilitation therapy, and basically warehoused and abandoned by Michael Scheibo, and her parents had no power.
Cut himself off from us, cut himself off from every fight, but his family, no more rehab. Put her in the nursing home, and that was it.
Michael Scheibo later stated that he stopped therapy because he believed it was futile. But the Schindlers suspected that Michael was influenced by a conflict of interest.
Michael, we learned, now had a girlfriend and was living with, shortly thereafter, was living with another woman.
I really wasn't upset because I thought maybe he would go on with his life and then we could just take care of Terry for the rest of our life.
at that time, we decided that we were going to have to go into the court and try to get guardianship removed from Michael. And we were quite encouraged. The fact that he admitted to being with another girl, the fact that this money was there, that he was going to inherit upon Terry's death, we were encouraged that guardianship, he was going to lose his guardianship. But he didn't. The courts constantly ruled in his favor.
Starting in 1993, the Schindlers fought unsuccessfully in court over Terry's guardianship and care. Meanwhile, Terry remained in nursing homes. Her early improvements did not continue. Her diagnosis, persistent vegetative state. What was Terry's diagnosis? What did it mean? It's important to understand persistent vegetative state in contrast to brain death. Terry Schiavo was not brain dead. She was not maintained or sustained at all by machines.
Terry was fed differently than you and I. She was fed through a tube, but she was fed at night. So during the day, she was sitting up in a chair watching TV, and she wasn't on any type of other machines. Nothing else was hooked up. There were no IVs. There was no respirators. Terry was simply disabled by it.
Colin Hugh, professor at Johns Hopkins, speaks about this. He says, PVS, persistent vegetative state, is not death hidden by machinery. Okay? It is life lived under altered neurological or mental circumstances. And the point he makes is that this distinction makes all the difference in the world for the doctors and nurses who care for those in a minimally conscious state.
Terry normally was still. She did not make sound. She didn't really move around much. But when she sensed her mother's presence and her smell and her touch, Terry lit up like a Christmas tree every time and began vocalizing.
She would immediately recognize her mom's voice, and a smile would immediately come to her face.
Hey, Mommy. Hi, baby. How are you?
She said, Terry, what are you doing?
She laughed at my dad's jokes. She giggled when my dad would kiss her with his mustache. She would pull away, and because he would purposely do it, of course. It scratch her face a little bit, and so she just had a huge connection with her family, as she always did.
She wasn't terminal. She was essentially physically healthy as you or I. I mean, all of her organs and her vital signs were very strong. She was a woman living with a disability, just like I believe there's 40 more million people in our country today that are living with some type of disability.
Huh? Can you look this way?
You know, we were visiting Terry. My parents were doing everything they could to at least provide her the stimulation they could, just as parents, to show her the love and passion that parents give a child.
Mama? Can you do Mama?
The next step we took is we wrote Michael Schiavo a letter. And we asked him, please give Terry back to us. No strings attached. We just want our daughter. And of course that letter was ignored.
No, too. Mama.
Terry languished without therapy or rehabilitation for 5 more years, while the Schindlers continued to fight for guardianship. Then, things took a turn for the worse.
8 years after her collapse in 1998 was when Michael finally decided that instead of doing what he promised he was going to do to the jury and to my family, he now petitioned the court to remove her feeding tube, subtly saying that Terry would not want to live as a disabled adult. We never anticipated that Michael would ever petition the court to have her feeding tube removed.
Hey, Wade?
Yeah.
Can you pause it right there?
Just disabled. Why?
Okay, you guys are about to go to break, but I wanted to point out, if you notice, for 5 years, guys, she went into basically a state-run home, which would not cost anything, so it's not draining down this court reward that she's got in the bank. She's not getting any therapy, which obviously would cost him something. But 5 years later, he then decides, hey, she wouldn't like this. She would want to be put down. Okay, y'all take a break. We'll see the rest of it when you come back.
You know how I printed the printer up in